Morning, this is Brian. Today is Wednesday, March 18th, 2026, and I'm here at Natalie Park, here at Lake Miramar Reservoir. Today's video is going to be a Trees of San Diego episode, and it's not going to be a specific episode focusing on one tree, but it's just going to be a few blurbs about the different trees planted and growing well here at Natalie Park. So, a small park. Lake Miramar is just over there, but there's quite a variety of trees and shrubs growing here. So I'm going to take some time on this video to showcase what grows here at Natalie Park. Quite a few different species, especially in the eucalypts. So first off, first segment of this video is going to focus on the eucalypts here at Natalie Park. So what do we have growing here at Natalie Park with regards to the eucalypts, including the genera of Eucalyptus and Corymbia, and quick little hints to tell them apart. So I'm going to start by our first eucalypt, which is the beautiful red ironbark, also known in Australia as mugga mugga. And this is Eucalyptus sideroxylon. This tree is generally very easy to tell apart from the other species of eucalypt here because of the telltale bark. You get deep brown and reddish brown hues and very deeply furrowed bark with black exudate. This is called kinno, the sap of the eucalyptus. Eucalyptus trees are very resinous trees, and therefore they exude a lot of it, which hardens and blackens on the outside, giving the trunks somewhat of a blackish appearance. So Eucalyptus sideroxylon. The foliage of Eucalyptus sideroxylon is grayish green, you can see here. It's a very handsome tree. Now, I did a Trees of San Diego specifically on this if you want to refer to more specific information, but the tree itself is native to parts of Australia. Not a surprise, eucalypts, Australia go hand in hand. And these trees, during the winter, the regular species will have white flowers, and then there is a specific type called rosea, which is a horticultural variant, which has pink flowers. Rosea, pinkish. I think a lot of the ones here, I think, are the regular ones, because there were a couple that were still blooming. So let's go over to a couple of these, and let's see if we can find some seed capsules up close. You see, a lot of eucalypts have different stages of leaves. Juvenile leaves on younger shoots, intermediate leaves on slightly older shoots, and then adult leaves on the oldest shoots. The juvenile leaves are not quite as narrow. You can see here, these are the juvenile leaves. Juvenile, intermittent. See here, these are a little more intermediate. And then on adult branches, the leaves are a little more elongated. And they're becoming a little bit more sickle shaped. Now, each species of eucalyptus, this is a dead leaf right here, each species of eucalyptus has its own aroma. Red ironbark has a very rich very rich camphory aroma, which is distinct from other species of eucalyptus and other eucalypts for that matter. We do have some seed capsules here too. I want to show you some seed capsules. Like I said, I did a full Trees of San Diego video on this 2 years ago. These are the seed capsules. Rounded, shiny brown before they dry up more. They're kind of a shiny brown, kind of cup-shaped, with the seeds inside the little valves at the top opening. So that's Eucalyptus sideroxylon. And again, telltale sign is that really furrowed bark. Let's get a couple pictures of these, and then I'll move on to another species. There are a few more here to talk about. Oh, wait a minute, do we still have flowers left? Okay, we still have some flowers left on this one, first of all. They're fading out. This is the Rosea, the pink. This is the horticultural variety Rosea, which is very popular here in San Diego and Southern California and other mild regions as a decorative cultivar of the regular species. You can see Eucalyptus, the species Eucalyptus, doesn't have petals. These are all stamens with a stigma in the middle. The stamens are the male portions of the flower, and the stigmas in the middle is the female portion. Like I said, the regular species is white. And here again are the seed capsules on Eucalyptus sideroxylon. Very handsome tree. Get some pictures of these trees. There's some generally much larger ones scattered around the lake, but I wanted to focus on this park here for this video. Okay, now we're going to talk about species number 2 and of our eucalypts. And this here is sugar gum, Eucalyptus claticalix. This is one of the largest trees growing here in San Diego. I've seen these trees get up to about 150 feet tall here in San Diego. These things can get massive. So I don't believe that there are any horticultural varieties of Eucalyptus claticalix, but it's one of the most common trees planted in San Diego County and in Southern California. And it's just enormous. It can get an absolutely humongous trunk and a very pleasing form and maturity. These are younger ones. There are a few older ones here and there in the area, but I'm focusing on the ones here in the park. And here they are. Now, Eucalyptus claticalix also goes through stages of different foliage. This is a seedling right here of Eucalyptus claticalix. The juvenile leaves are very rounded, often with a little notch in the top. Very handsome. The adult leaves are leathery and kind of thick and a little shiny. So if you see a little bit of a shine or a little bit of a sheen, you're probably looking at Eucalyptus claticalix. If we look at this tree here, we have a few claticalix growing around here. If you look up towards the crown of the tree, it has a little bit of a shine to it. Now, when these trees get much larger and much older, their form is a little bit distinct from the other species because of the way their branching structure is. See, these ones don't really show too much, but on more mature, taller trees, they seem to have puffs of branches. Puffs. Branches are puffs everywhere. So they seem to have bare spots of branch and then dense little puffs of foliage scattered through the crown. That's one telltale sign of Eucalyptus claticalix. Now this tree, I believe, is completely south Australia endemic. Endemic to the state of South Australia. You see these leaves? More leathery, a little shinier. These are intermediate leaves. Intermediate leaves, just like on the other species, the Sideroxylon, are not super elongated and narrow and not quite as sickle-shaped as the adult leaves. But you can see, again, there's kind of a bit of a sheen to the foliage of this tree. Now, like the other species, it's eucalyptus, no petals, and the flowers are more of a creamish color. And usually you'll find them more during the winter time. The seed capsules are these kind of urn-shaped, kind of narrow urn-shaped, a little more urn-shaped, a little less rounded than Eucalyptus sideroxylon. And these are quite easy to germinate. I've been fortunate enough to germinate the seeds several years ago of Eucalyptus platycalyx. Very handsome tree. These leaves will get a little more narrow and sickle-shaped when they're older, but not quite as narrow as some species. Again, very rich and leathery, and they're not as strongly fragrant. They do have a little bit of a camphor aroma, but they're not quite as strongly fragrant as the other species, Eucalyptus sideroxylon, which is very fragrant. A very fragrant tree. These ones, you have to kind of crush them, leaves a little bit harder to get that camphor aroma. And it does have a pleasant aroma. It's just not as strong. Let's go look over. There's a bunch of Eucalyptus platycalyx seedlings all over the place. But here's what I was talking about before. Eucalyptus platycalyx tends to get puffs, little puffs of foliage interspersed amongst bare branches. It's going to be pretty typical, especially when these trees get tall. So a lot of times if you see them with little puffs of foliage like that, you're probably looking at Eucalyptus platycalyx. Very handsome tree. Here are the seed capsules of Eucalyptus platycalyx again. Wait a minute. Hold on. I'm tripping. That was something else. Yeah. So yeah, Eucalyptus platycalyx. Let's get a few pictures of these trees. Okay, here's some more adult leaves on Eucalyptus platycalyx. This is what they look like when they're mature, only they're kind of medium, sometimes olive green and shiny. A little narrower, maybe some slight sickle shape, as you see here. Again, here are the urn-shaped seed capsules. Let's go ahead and rip open. Like, these are dead leaves. I don't like ripping live leaves off the trees. Yeah, not extremely fragrant. Not extremely fragrant, but a slight aroma. Yep, and here's our bark. The bark on platycalyx is very similar to some other species of eucalyptus that grow here. So bark's not always the best indicator of your species, but it's slightly mottled, different shades of gray, maybe some slight greenish and slight brownish, and it peels. It's not as furrowed like Eucalyptus sideroxylon. So you get lots of bark peels all over the ground on Eucalyptus platycalyx. Great place to see Eucalyptus platycalyx pretty much anywhere in San Diego County below 3,000 feet. Not in the mountains, really high in the mountains, of course, but from coast to inland foothills, Eucalyptus platycalyx is a dime a dozen. It's one of the most commonly planted eucalyptus trees here in Southern California. All right, so now I'm going to go and start talking about a third species, which is another very common one. So for a third species of eucalyptus, we are looking at river red gum, Eucalyptus comodulensis. This is another one of the most commonly planted trees in Southern California's lower elevations. It does kind of look similar to Eucalyptus platycalyx. The only one major difference is, and you can also refer to a Trees of San Diego episode I did on the river red gum a few years ago, where I go more in detail about this tree. This tree is very widespread, especially in the outback, especially in the interior sections of Australia, throughout the continent. Lots and lots of this tree, and is very commonly grown here in San Diego too. Here's some Eucalyptus comodulensis right here, characterized by grayish green foliage, very typical. Also goes through different stages of foliage. Has similar to Cladicalix, but maybe a little more shaped like that. This is the juvenile foliage of Eucalyptus comodulensis. Very fragrant too, by the way. Eucalyptus comodulensis has a very nice fragrance, distinct from the other species. And the bark on Eucalyptus comodulensis varies. The base of the trees, you can either have very flaky, sometimes even furrowed bark. Sometimes the base of the trees can be medium grayish brown and furrowed. And then the higher up you go, it becomes smooth and mottled, just like Eucalyptus cladicalix. But again, the lighter gray-green foliage of Eucalyptus comodulensis is very distinct from the shinier olive green of this here, which is cladicalix. Now, Eucalyptus comodulensis also goes through, again, different stages of foliage. You saw the juvenile. Here are some more intermediate leaves right here. And eventually they become sickle-shaped. Your typical, stereotypical eucalyptus, sickle-shaped leaves. During the winter, green, little green buds produce these little creamy white flowers and really small seed capsules. Let's see if I could find some around here. I'm not really finding any seed capsules on Eucalyptus comodulensis. Kind of disappointed. But they're really small and button-shaped. Kind of small and button-shaped, usually three or four chambered, really small and a little bit flatter than the urn-shaped seed capsules seen on Eucalyptus cladicalix and the rounded goblet shape of Eucalyptus sideroxylon. But Eucalyptus comodulensis is quite a common fixture here. A lot of these are comodulensis here, and of course we got more cladicalix here as well. But now I'm going to move on. If you refer to my Trees of San Diego if you really want to see the seed capsules on that. I'm going to move on after a couple of pictures, and we're going to start talking about our next species. And here's our next species of eucalyptus. This one can be locally commonly planted here, another Aussie. And this is called bushy yate. And this is Eucalyptus conferruminata. This one isn't quite so bushy. This one's got a single trunk. And it can be single trunked, but it can often be either branched from very low or multi-trunked, aka bushy. Eucalyptus conferruminata, sometimes confused with another species called Eucalyptus leymanii, similar species. This one here has some different leaves, not quite sickle shaped, not typically sickle shaped. A little bit leathery, a little bit of a sheen as well. You can see how much smaller the leaves are on bushy yate than on other species. Now, let's see, let me get a dead leaf and get the fragrance of this guy. Very nice. Kind of similar to Eucalyptus comodolensis, which also has a nice camphor aroma. But the leaves, again, much smaller, much shorter. And these are the seed capsules. They're in globular clusters. You see these here, these ball shaped. These are clusters of seed capsules. There's several seed capsules per cluster, as you see here. And there's a little spiky horn-shaped protuberance at the end of it. The flower buds are pretty interesting too. The flower buds. Now, eucalyptus flower buds on the species of eucalyptus have bud caps that fall off before the stamens bust out. In botanical terms, it's called the bud caps are called opercula. I'm trying to see if I could find flower buds. I know I saw some. Let's see if I could find some. Nothing that's really close for me to reach, unfortunately. Let me see, I'm gonna look around for a minute. All right, found some flower buds. I'm gonna try to be very careful with this branch. See these things? These are the bud caps. Bud caps are very long and columnar. Pretty unusual on eucalyptus. Usually they're rounded or slightly pointed at the tip. These are going to fall off when they get large enough, and then all the stamens are going to start busting out. Eucalyptus, no petals. So those are very interesting opercula on the Eucalyptus conferruminata. Very interesting bushy tree. Very handsome small tree. Can't be quite commonly landscaped, especially in areas that require a smaller tree as opposed to some of these others. We were reviewing Eucalyptus sideroxylon can get up to at least 80 feet tall. Eucalyptus cladicalix, you need a lot of room for that tree because it can get up to 150 plus feet tall. And Eucalyptus comodolensis can also probably exceed 150 feet tall as well in certain circumstances. Usually closer to 100, but still quite large. These will usually stay under 35, 40 feet tall. I mean, maybe occasionally larger in really favorable conditions, but they're adapted very well to these dry conditions here. So yeah, the Eucalyptus conferruminata. Time for a few pictures of the tree itself. Okay, now it's time to move on to our final eucalypt here, and that is this tree here. This is lemon scented gum. This is Corymbia citriodora, formerly known as Eucalyptus citriodora, and sometimes still treated as such by botanists. Now, Corymbia is another genus of eucalypts, pretty closely related to the genus Eucalyptus. Sometimes Corymbia is treated as a subgenus or a section of Eucalyptus by some botanists. But as of now, it's officially named Corymbia citriodora, and it is a tall, willowy tree with gracefully drooping branches at maturity, and has a very distinct citronella aroma to it. It's very pleasant. It's a very refreshing aroma. And it is quite a striking tree when it gets to maturity. And these can get over 100 feet tall as well. So you need quite a bit of room if you're going to grow Corymbia citriodora. Now, there's really not much of a juvenile foliage phase on Corymbia citriodora. Well, no, I'm tripping. Scratch that. There is. The juvenile foliage, and I'm not really seeing many examples of it, is a little bit broader. It's kind of cleft at the base, and it's very bristly, and very, very aromatic. So if you gently rub the leaves, the juvenile leaves of a Corymbia citriodora seedling, it's going to smell very strongly of that citronella smell for which this tree is noted. So on juveniles, especially seedlings and saplings, you rub those leaves, rub those bristly leaves, they will permeate your nose with some wonderful aromas. And Corymbia citriodora is also known for having relatively smooth bark that peels. It does peel yearly. You can see old bark peels on the ground. But a lot of times it's left with a light gray, sometimes slightly mottled, sometimes nearly uniform color. Very beautiful. Now when the leaves are adults, the adult leaves are usually quite narrow, sickle-shaped, and light green with a little bit of a sheen to them. You can see how these leaves are very narrow right here on Corymbia citriodora. Well, the genus Corymbia is also known as the bloodwood section of the eucalypts. Now, Corymbia is still considered a eucalypt, even though most botanists have separated it from the genus Eucalyptus. And just like with eucalyptus, the flower buds, they're small, they're kind of conical shaped, they're small, and they form bud caps or opercula, which fall off. And again, the flowers are apetalous, no petals, and they are full of stamens with the stigma in the middle. So here's some saplings right here of Corymbia citriodora. This is the intermediate phase. They do have a slight intermediate phase as well. Now, I'm trying to see if I can find juvenile leaves. Okay, here we go. Perfect example. This is what a juvenile leaf looks like. It's not really clasped, but you can see the stalk comes out here. The petiole doesn't come out at the base. It comes out right here. And you won't see it on camera, but this is very bristly and rough sandpapery texture. This is the full juvenile leaf that you'll see on seedlings and saplings. And it is very fragrant. Even 3 times as fragrant. So these are the intermediate leaves, and the adult leaves will be a little narrower. Here we see a bunch of Corymbia citriodora saplings all over the place. These are mostly lemon-scented gums. Now it's time to try to see if I can find seed capsules. The flowers are kind of cream-colored, typical of eucalypt. Let's see if I can find a seed capsule. So while I'm looking, let's get a couple pictures of this. I don't know why I'm struggling to find seed capsules. Kind of disappointed because I wanted to show you. I'll probably just draw an try to draw an illustration and do that. Try to just draw an illustration and insert it as a photo. Oh well. Well, we'll describe them as relatively urn-shaped, like Eucalyptus cladocalyx. Corymbia citriodora has an urn-shaped seed capsule. The urn-shaped, sometimes tapering a little bit up towards the top, and the chambers inside the seed capsule are a little sunken in, which is pretty characteristic of Corymbia. tree or... Well, I think that's going to conclude my thoughts on the eucalypts here at Natalie Park. We'll get a few pictures of the trees, and we'll move on to our next bit. Get a few pictures of each species I highlighted. Alright, it's time for section 2 of the trees of San Diego, trees of Natalie Park. We're going to focus on the conifers now. Conifers are cone-bearing trees. In other words, they don't form true flowers or true fruit. They form male pollen cones that roughly look like flowers, and their cones are roughly like the fruit, but not true fruit. So, I have a few species of conifers here. I'm going to start with the pine family, because we have two different types of conifer families here: pine family and cypress family. So I'm going to start with the pine family, and species here are pretty closely related. Now here at Natalie Park, we have, I believe, 3 species. It looks like we have the first species here, which is the Canary Island pine, Pinus canariensis, which is a medium to quite tall tree from the Canary Islands in the Atlantic, found on, I believe, volcanic rock, volcanic soils in the mountains of the Canary Islands. Now in San Diego County, which is one of the most commonly planted pines, it's generally a more upright, almost mountain pine shaped tree. But it's not closely related to any of our mountain pines, which are native to our mountains. We have Coulter pine, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, knobcone pine, but Canary Island pine is not closely related to any of those at all. It's in a group that's often found in Europe, the Mediterranean, and of course the Canary Islands, where Canary Island pine is. So it is in a group called the Pinaster group, the Pinaster section. And again, it looks like our mountain pines. It's upright, narrow, and can get quite tall. It can get well over 100 feet here in Southern California. In the Canary Islands, I believe it can get up to possibly 200 feet, but 150 is not super uncommon. And yeah, it's got a generally narrow, but sometimes they do get irregular and fork off and stuff, but generally they're more upright, and they got that roughly narrow conical pine shape. Now the needles on Canary Island pine, they're in bundles of 2, which is very common in the Pinaster group. Let's pull off an old group here if I can. Groups of 2. Canary Island pines are in groups of 2. Well, this one looks like sometimes groups of 3. This one's got groups of 3. I guess you can have groups of 3 as well. Canary Island pines have very long needles. This one's not so long because this is a little bit drier here, but sometimes the needles of Canary Island pine are very long, especially where it's planted in irrigated settings where there's a lot of moisture, and it can look quite luxuriant with really long needles that are sometimes up to a foot long, and they're kind of grassy, and when they get long enough, they kind of droop down a little bit from the center. Definitely a very commonly planted tree because it does well in our climate, Mediterranean climate, dry summers, wet winters, and so forth, and subtropical areas, and it gives you the illusion of the mountain pines that grow in our mountains. So that's partly why they are so commonly planted here, because people like to recreate that aesthetic. Here's a Canary Island pine, and see if I can find some cones. Finding Aleppo pine cones, I think. That's a tree I'm going to be talking about later. Canary Island pine cones look like this, but they can often get quite a bit bigger. Sometimes they can get up to about 6 inches long. And at the bottom of the cone scale is a little knobby protuberance. It's not a spine. It's not a spine like on our mountain pines like ponderosa and Jeffrey pines. It's just a knob. It's pretty common in the Pinaster to have knob-like growth. So there's your Canary Island pine cone. And here's your bark. It's flaky and furrowed. Sometimes a little quirky. And again, here where the needles start getting a little bit longer, as you can see here. It can be quite long. Like I said, the moisture location in like irrigated parks, these are very commonly planted in parks. Their needles can get like twice as long as this. So here's your bark. And you'll notice one thing you don't see on a whole lot of pines are these little shoots that come out the side. Most pines that I know of, you cut them down, they're gone. It's over. It's done. But if you cut one of these down, if there's just enough room, they can sprout from the stump. So these are stump sprouters. Not extremely common in the pine family. And these are, again, pines are in the pine family of Pinaceae. So this is the Canary Island pine. These are more modest examples, but like, these can get 3 times as large as these sometimes. And I've seen some at Presidio Park in San Diego. If you watch my video on Presidio Park, you'll see where I'm next to really big ones with wide trunks that actually their bark actually plates out like a ponderosa or a Jeffrey pine, to which it's not really related. When they get large enough, sometimes their bark can plate out, sometimes a little bit. You'll see some large ones there, and in Balboa Park, I think is where there are some enormous specimens of Canary Island pines. Let's get a few pictures of these trees, and we'll start talking about my next conifer. All right, I think it's time that we start talking about our next pine family tree. And that are these real wild looking buggers here. These are Aleppo pines, Pinus halepensis. Pinus halepensis, another extremely common, another one of the most commonly planted conifers, not native here in Southern California. They love the dry, arid climates, or semi-arid and Mediterranean climates of Mediterranean and the Middle East. Now these are quite extreme examples of how crazy and wild these things can grow. So the Aleppo pine is another member of the Pinaster group. Again, none of which are native here in Southern California. So this is Pinus halepensis of the Mediterranean and Middle East. I think Syria and some other places. I eventually will get to a specific episode of Trees of San Diego solely on this tree eventually. I'll get to one of those, hopefully eventually soon, where I actually talk more in details just about this tree. These other, like I said, this is a little bit more of a generalized video. But Aleppo pine. Now let's talk about Canary Island pines before. Canary Island pines, I gotta go backtrack a little bit. Canary Island pines kind of have a rich aroma, a rich pine aroma. They're pines, they're resinous. Well, Aleppo pines tend to have a little bit of a slightly sweeter pine aroma. very, very nice. I can smell it right now. It is a very pleasant piney smell. And I'm glad to be around it right now because it's getting warm out here. We're expecting quite a hot day today. So the smell of the pine is really carrying. So again, this is a pinaster. This is a pinaster group. And these needles are in bundles of 2. Much smaller needles than the related Canary Island pine, which can get very long, 4 or 5 times longer than these. And then we got these little small cones, much smaller cones. And again, they can get a little bit larger than this, but fairly typical. There's really not much of a, there's not a spine or anything that's going to poke you on the bottom of these cone scales. These are a little more typical. Cones for Pinus halepensis. These can get quite large too. They're not extremely tall trees. I haven't seen any more than maybe about 80 feet tall, but sometimes they can get very large trunks with age, and with age they can become very irregular growing. When they first start out as saplings, they can be surprisingly pyramid shaped like your typical Christmas tree, but with age they start growing, sometimes leaning. You can see this Aleppo pine's leaning over. And sometimes they can be forked, sometimes even multi-trunked, with branches spreading and ascending. It's really crazy. But it is a pine that does very well in our Mediterranean type climate. So it's definitely very adaptable, and it does have the propensity to spread. Like I have found these trees in very random places where you wouldn't expect to see anything. They do naturalize locally, and you will find saplings periodically, sometimes quite abundantly in irrigated areas. You'll see them grow quite prolifically. So what kind of bark do we have on the Aleppo pine? These are younger branches, which are kind of flaky bark, but with age, these trunks get much more furrowed. Kind of like this right here. They get deeply furrowed with age. Now, unlike the Canary Island pine, I've never seen these stump sprout. So if you cut one down, that's probably it. Probably the swan song for your pine. So if you're trying to expect it to become real bushy and stump sprout, not going to happen. Not with your Aleppo pine. So we're going to get some pictures of these trees and move on to the next species. Well, before I let you go, let's go up this trail for a minute. This is a young Aleppo pine, which is still pretty regular, relatively regular shaped. Right here. That's a Canary Island, and that's a Canary Island. As you can see, kind of has that roughly pyramid shape. That's how they start off a lot of times when they're young. Pinus halepensis. And these things can start producing cones when they're barely a few years old. Look at that bright green, beautiful foliage on Pinus halepensis. Those are all cones right there. Those are young cones that are light brown colored, and they're closed, and they're just so satisfying looking. Here's some juvenile cones right here. These are so cool. This one's a little older. And that one opened up relatively recently. Such cool trees. I love Aleppo pines. Of course, I love pretty much everything. Surprise, surprise. All right. I'm going to start moving on to our next species. I believe we have one more species in here. We have at least 2 more species here in Lake Miramar. But in Natalie Park itself, I'm focusing on this area before this becomes a 2-hour video. So I'm going to go to what I suspect is another species. Well, here we go. Here's another one. Here's another pinaster too, by the way. This is Afghan pine, Pinus aldarica. Very similar to the Aleppo pine, sometimes almost undistinguishable. The difference is the crowns on adult Afghan pines tend to be a little less irregular, not perfectly, but a little bit more of the upright pine shape you can expect. The cones are very similar. The needles are very similar. Needles are in bundles of 2. And again, this is a pinaster too, another pinaster group pine. Another Middle Eastern pine. But this one tends to be a little bit more upright. Sometimes gets a little irregular with age. But typically retains some more of its typical pine shape. So, Pinus aldarica. Some slightly more adult Pinus aldaricas. Not perfectly so-called pine shape, but these are below the park. Yep, Pinus aldarica. These are flooded out by the water, so there's no trail down here anymore. The Natalie Park is just up here. But yeah, I wanted to show you some more adult ones. Their cones are maybe a little bit smaller. So I'm going to focus on one more. It's not really in Natalie Park, but it's just across. Unfortunately, it's kind of submerged. So this is yet another pinaster group. This is the Italian stone pine. Stone pine, Pinus pinea. Another close relative of the Afghan pines and Canary Island pines and the Aleppo pines. Now, they can start off pretty broad crowns, sometimes even slightly pyramidal when they're young, but eventually they get these dome-shaped crowns with age. Pinus pinea with age. And their needles tend to be a medium green, sometimes a little bit darker. Sometimes quite rusty too. Black sooty rust on there. But they're 2-needle pines as well. 2-needle pines. But their cones are a bit larger. Their cones are quite a bit larger on these. I don't see any cones, but they're definitely quite a bit larger. And they have much larger seeds, which when you crack it open, the seed is edible. Those are the source of your pine nuts, the pignoli in Italian, pignoli. Un pignole is a pine seed, kind of similar to the Spanish word piñón, which is a pine seed coming from the pinyon pines. But this is not related to the pinyon pines. These, again, are different. So kind of like the Afghan pine, you get a little bit more of a rich green. Rich green, and if you go to Europe and you see these trees planted, or you see these trees along the Appian Way in Rome, a lot of times they're really tall. They got tall, narrow trunks with a little mushroom-shaped crown of foliage at the top. I don't usually see them get super tall like that with little small mushroom-shaped crowns. Usually here, they've got short trunk, or sometimes multiple trunks with a big, wide, oval-shaped crown. So that's the Italian stone pine, Pinus pinea. Yet another pinaster here. Let's get some pictures, get a picture or two, and I'm going to move on. So that basically is going to cover for the pine family here. I'm going to get a couple pictures of each tree species, and we'll move on to another conifer group. Okay, time for the second group of conifers. There's actually 3 types of conifers here. So I'm going to go here and get this one here. This is called Cook Island pine. It's in the Araucariaceae, Araucaria columnaris. Araucaria columnaris, native to the Cook Islands in the Pacific. And it's a tropical, subtropical tree. It does well in the warmer Mediterranean climates that don't get super cold. See, he's planted a lot in the subtropics and tropics as well. You see these planted a lot especially here in Southern California, but see these planted, I think, in Florida and other places like that too. They have kind of flaky, furrowed bark and groups of branches, branchlets that produce little individual needles, but when it falls off, the group falls off, not just the individual needle. And it gets these cones that are round shaped, and they fall to the ground and they bust open. And these things can get up to over 100 feet tall. I think probably even taller in their native habitats. But they are known for leaning. This one seems to be leaning towards the south a little bit. So yeah, these tend to lean when they get older. Sometimes they start off very upright and narrow. And they're typically narrowly crowned trees, but they often get very crooked and they lean to one side, which is very typical. Other Araucarias, I don't think do it as much as this. It's pretty common with columnaris. Let's get a picture or two of this. You notice the branching structure kind of branches out in tiers, kind of like a star shape. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 branches out like a star. It's pretty cool. Pretty common in Araucarias. And they can be very resinous trees as well. So you can get some sap exudate on them as well. So Araucaria columnaris. So that's going to do it for other Araucariaceae. Got one more conifer group that I'm going to discuss briefly. The cypress family, the Cupressaceae, which is represented by, looks like 2 species here. Let's go find them and let's talk a little bit about them. So we have 2 species here, 2 types of cypress family plant here. This is the columnar Italian cypress. This is Cupressus sempervirens stricta. This is a horticultural variant that is grown to be very narrow and tall. Very narrow, kind of narrow spires. They're not really super large trees, at least not here. I've seen them maybe up to 60, 70 feet tall. But these are the type that you often see planted in rows, especially in these Mediterranean climates. They're native to the Mediterranean in Europe. Narrow, sometimes unbelievably narrow. Now, there are other types of conifers that are also shaped narrow like this as well. But I'm focusing on this one here. And these trees when, and you're not going to see it much here, but when they're mature, they kind of have a gray, shreddy bark. And their leaves are in scales. So my thumb is basically touching several scale-like leaves on these little branchlets. Now, how you can tell this apart from other columnar cypress family relatives is it's got oval-shaped seed cones, or almost football-shaped seed cones. They're narrower than they are long, so they're kind of slightly oval, almost football-shaped, and they open and release the small seeds. A lot of times you'll see the bunch of little woody cones that are maybe about this, maybe about 2.5 inches long by 1.5 inches wide. They're gray. They're gray when they mature, and sometimes you'll see little open cones all over the ground. That is your seed cone on Cupressus sempervirens. Now, the wild form, the regular form, can also be kind of narrow, but it's definitely a little more irregular, and it's not as neatly columnar as the stricta horticultural variant is. So, if that's what you're expecting, especially if you grow seed from a plant, you might get the wild form. Honestly, I like the wild form as well. I like Cupressus sempervirens, the regular form, very much actually, and find it to be a very attractive tree. And it's another resinous tree that has a very pleasant Christmassy aroma. Always love the aroma of Cupressus sempervirens on a warm day, walking underneath a row of them planted in somebody's yard. If I'm walking on the sidewalk, you catch the aroma of it. It is pleasant. Cupressus sempervirens, the Italian cypress. Moving on to our last tree species of the day. There are a couple of other random species of trees, not very much. It's mostly eucalypts and conifers. Well, look at this one here. This is a Leland cypress. It's another member of the cypress family. And it is comprised of 2 California native species. It is a hybrid, a horticultural hybrid of 2 California natives. So this is a California native DNA. This is composed of Cupressus or Hesperocyparis macrocarpa, Monterey cypress, and the Port Orford cedar, Chamaecyparis lawsoniana. It gets its flattened sprays from the Port Orford cedar, Chamaecyparis lawsoniana. And it gets its kind of nicely tiered branching structure from its Monterey cypress. When Monterey cypress trees are young, they're kind of tiered, their branches kind of tear out like this. Now, Leland cypress has these small little cypress-like cones, pretty typical for Cupressaceae. Woody seed cones, a lot smaller. Very nice, very handsome. I'm surprised this has cones on it. The Italian cypress is similar, but the cones are 5 times larger and more oval shaped. But yeah, that's what the seed cones look like. Very handsome. And there you have it. Get a couple pictures and like a picture or two, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it and then wrap this up. So yep, Leland cypress kind of has gray bark, that flakes and furrows when it gets older. Sometimes these trees can get up to about 40, 50 feet tall. One caveat about using Leland cypress is they are very susceptible to disease. Very susceptible to diseases. And I think they usually perform better in a coastal climate. When they're young, they can be extremely fast growing, very quickly growing trees, but eventually they start dying back, and unfortunately does not bode well. However, me being a tree lover, it's hard to deny it is a pretty handsome tree that has the purposeful breeding of two California native plants. The Port Orford cedar and the Monterey cypress. Do much better on the coast. Further inland, they're definitely going to be susceptible to rotting. Just like the Monterey cypress is usually only good by the really close coastal areas. So there you go. So I'm going to get some last pictures of our cypress family remnants, and I'm going to do some wrap-up thoughts. So, went through basically, let's see, myrtle, pine, araucaria, and such. Went through four families of trees. One family of broadleaf trees, the eucalypts, in the myrtle family, the Myrtaceae. Then I covered the pine family, representatives here. Several species of pines growing here. One species of Araucariaceae, the Cook Island pine, and the cypress family, which we have two representatives here. So Natalie Park's got quite a nice array of trees. There are a couple other random plants that grow here. I'm not going to really cover those, or else it's going to be a 2-hour video, which I'm not intending. So I wanted to focus on the eucalypts and the conifers, which make up about 95% of the trees that are growing here. I'm not going to talk about the shrubs. You know I love shrubs, but like I said, I wanted to keep this video a little more focused. It's already long enough as it is. But yeah, come here to Natalie Park and check out these trees for yourself. Hey, thanks for coming along. Appreciate watching and checking out my videos. Hope you enjoyed and learned something fun from this. It's going to do it for me. I'm going to head home because it's getting hot out. See you on the next video.